Hello, everybody. This video is about helping you write your resources and differentiation section for your lesson plan. So I'm going to be talking about selecting resources and materials, mainly your texts, but this could also be activities and different ways that you're supporting your students based off of their interest and their needs. So when we're talking about the resources, you want to go back to your teaching context summary where you did the survey and you did the diagnostic, and to recall what are they interested in, what is their skill set, what is their proficiency level, what are the things that they need to work on. Same thing with differentiating. If you recall back when you wrote your teaching context summary, you should have had a section where you talked about your emergent bilingual students, what proficiency level they're at, and as well as your special needs students and what differentiation that they need. So remember, when you're writing these sections, go back to that teaching context summary so this can be easier for you to write. So selecting, hold on. There we go. Okay, so selecting resources and materials. So a few things to ask when you're writing this section. What kinds of texts and activities can I incorporate that will meet students where they are in interest and in their skill set? So again, if you're teaching a history class and say you're teaching about Pearl Harbor, maybe it's not the most interesting thing to them in the moment, right? And so how do you bring in things that are more engaging to them, pop culture, things that are happening in the current moment that perhaps bridges the gap between what you're trying to teach and what students are interested in. Same thing with their skill set, right? How do I bring in texts and activities that help meet students where they are with their skills in math, in history, in reading, writing, whatever content you're teaching, so that they can eventually get to what you're trying to teach them. Selecting resources, also think about making your lesson more concrete, visual, and engaging, right? The less engaging lessons are ones where the teachers just talk or you just use your textbook. So if you are required to use your textbook, how are you bringing in other materials that help bring the content alive? How do you help students visualize these things? How do you make it more concrete? So consider a real life situation in which they can apply your content objective, right? So we are living in pandemic times, right? So this is something that we're all navigating right now. Are there ways, if you were teaching this lesson in this moment, are there ways to connect to what's happening in real life right now? Are there ways to connect to things that are happening in your students' communities and their lives? And then also, when you're thinking about choosing different texts for your class, you also want to think about complexity. So like, how hard is it to read that text? What grade level is it at? Or what lexile is it at? The last course reading that we had for our class talks all about text sets, right? And so choosing reading that is just at the right level for students, where I would say about half of it is digestible and comprehensible. They're, they're able to comprehend it on their own. And then there are a few words and ideas that they need to use those extra skills to figure out, or maybe they might need support from you. So that's kind of a good way to gauge whether a text is a good level for them. Some other tips. So again, you want to bridge the gap between required boring materials and more engaging ones. So you can use things like songs, movies, advertisements. I really like to use like simulations and games sometimes to bring students into the content. So like, you know, with the relevance warm up, when you're front loading vocabulary, how do you bring in something that will hook your students at the beginning of your lesson? Also think about ways to bring in multiple perspectives, right? So if you're teaching history or if you're teaching about a certain topic, we talked about controversial topics in our class, how do you bring in multiple perspectives so that it's not just one dominant narrative in your class? And the other thing to keep in mind is, you know, when we think about designing our lessons, sometimes we get really excited that we want to put everything in. but we also want to make sure that everything that you are choosing to put into your lesson relates back to your content objective, right? And it relates back to your academic language objective as well. So here's an example from Liz. This is how it looks in the lesson plan template for you. So again, it says you must include a core text and a supplemental text that engages students in critical multiliteracy skills. So you can mix any of the following: a textbook paragraph, an art piece, poem, news article, math problem, etc., etc. Right? So for Liz's class, this was a math class that she was teaching. So you notice here, all of your resources need to relate either to your content objective on the left side, or your resources should relate back to your academic language and your ELD objective on the right side. So you can see on the left side, Liz has provided a diagram of a right triangle highlighting the academic vocabulary. She has two math problems that present two different scenarios. And then that third bullet point, she chose a real world examples that students connect to be able to recognize that math is present everywhere in our everyday lives, right? So she literally had to create her own math problem to make it more relevant to students. On the right side, so you notice sometimes these things are kind of redundant, so it's perfectly fine to have a bullet point that says same as to the left, so you don't have to repeat yourself. Notice that she has some things that are translated specifically for her emergent bilingual students. She also has a TA. So if you have a TA in your class, please list that as a resource. That's really good to include. And then any assistive technology that you're using for students, include that as well. So that's resources. Now we're going to talk about differentiation. And this is very much related to what we just talked about with resources, right? Sometimes the resources that you use, whether it's graphic organizers or a text that is translated, right? That's a differentiation strategy. So some of this is going to overlap. So remember, this should hopefully be a review. Differentiation is all about making certain parts of your lesson different based off of how your students learn, right? All of our students learn differently. So there's two kinds of differentiation. One is accommodation. This is when you change how a student learns the material. This often has to do with what they are using to learn, or the place or the time. So for example, in Liz's example, some students were using material in English. Some students used translated materials, right? With place, you might consider, is it better for a student to sit next to me because they pay attention better? Do I want to do certain groupings for students where they're sitting with folks who they work well with? Maybe they're sitting next to someone that can help translate and translanguage the material with them. Perhaps some students need more time, right? So those are all accommodations. For this one, we want to make sure that students still meet the same expectations as the whole class. You're not changing the expectations for students. So again, some examples: adding audio to a reading, moving students' seat next to the teacher, like I said before, and extra time on the test. Modifications. On the other hand, a modification is changing what a student is taught or expected to learn. So this means changing the content, the process, or the product. So when it comes to content, maybe you're recognizing that a certain, if you have a special needs student and they're not quite ready to write a whole 5-paragraph essay, right? Maybe they're only going to write a 3-paragraph essay. So in that way, it changes the product, right? The process could also be different in terms of how they show you, how they work on the assignment. So maybe some students will work in groups, but some students work better individually. This case, they're not expected to learn the same material as their classmates. So some examples are shorter assignments, like I said before. Maybe certain students have a different list of vocabulary to study because maybe they're at different proficiency levels in English. I had a student a while back where it was very hard for her to do presentations to the whole class. And so I had her present to me only. But one thing I want to highlight here is that as much as possible, we don't want to lower our expectations for students. So say for instance, with a student who I had present only to me, I also had her write a reflection on how she could eventually present to a larger audience, right? So we always want to think about how do we meet the students where they are, and also help um, how do we help support them so that they can get to the place where we want them to be. So here's Liz's example again in her lesson plan. So you'll see again for the differentiation on the left side, these are accommodations or modifications based off of your content objective. And then on the right hand side, it's things to meet your ELD objective. The reason why the lesson plan template is written this way is because when you do the CalTPA during your phase 3, you always want to make sure that you are keeping your objectives in mind when you're developing these different components. So you'll see on differentiation on the left side for Liz's content objective, she talks about real world applications. She has them working in partners. She has a handout, right? So these are all different things that are helping students, helping accommodate them. And then on the right side for the ELD objectives, she has a bunch of sentence starters at different levels. She has them grouped in specific ways. And then you'll notice the second to last bullet point draws specifically from an IEP or a 504 plan. And then the last one again is about how she uses technology to support students. All that aside, what I do want to highlight is that the best differentiation comes from building authentic relationships with students to understand their social, emotional, and academic needs, right? So if we're thinking about this moment in time, again, with the pandemic, I've tried my best to differentiate for different students. Some students are able to work on a weekly basis. Some students are understandably busy with other things, with family, with figuring out work. It's also a very difficult time emotionally right now. And so what I wanted to do was offer a variety of accommodations for students, and kind of giving ways for students to work at their own pace, right? So that's one way to differentiate. So what I'm trying to say here is that you really can't differentiate for students if you don't actually know who they are and what they're needing and where they're at in the moment, right? So it really starts with building relationships with students. So your next steps, write your resources section. Remember to include a core text that relates to your content and a supplemental text that helps bring more engagement and or rigor. So again, an example could be a traditional math problem and then a math problem that you've designed yourself that relates to real life from your students. It could be a news clip that introduces historical period. It could be an advertisement that helps demonstrate a rhetorical device. Again, these are examples, but you get to come up with your own. Also write your differentiation section. Remember to include accommodations and or modifications based off of your teaching context summary. So remember, again, go back to your focal students, your immersion bilingual student, your advanced student, and your special needs student. And that should really help you write that section. You can see the example in the weeks folder for more ideas. That's the one that I went over with Liz. There is another file in this week's folder called differentiation strategies. So there's a whole list of other ways you can accommodate and modify your lesson for students. And then if you need help, have some questions, or you want to share some ideas, feel free to go to the discussion board. Cool. Thank you.